Hi everyone, TG Wolff here. Today's author is Kathleen Marple Kolb. When Hollywood comes to a small Connecticut town, it should be the stuff of dreams. But a fading movie star drops dead on set, and a whole different kind of stuff hits the fan. Historian Christian Shaw uses her knowledge of old things to track the killer in The Stuff of Murder, Kathleen Marple Kolb's new Old Stuff mystery, out now from Level Best Books. Welcome to Mysteries to Die For. I am TG Wolff, and I'm here with Jack, my piano player and producer. This is a podcast where we combine storytelling with original music to put you at the heart of a mystery. All of our stories are structured to challenge you to beat the detective to the solution. These are arrangements, which means instead of word-for-word readings, you get a performance that's meant to be heard. Jack and I perform these live, front to back, no breaks, no fakes, no retakes. This is Season 7, Games People Play. Now, games are about competition conducted according to rules with participants working toward a goal. Games are a part of every culture and are one of the oldest forms of social interaction and engagement. Games can be fun, challenging, and exhilarating. They can also be intense, cutthroat, and lethal. This season, our authors have fashioned deadly games and unscrupulous villains to test your detection skills. This is Episode 14, Sorry is the featured game. This is Sorry, Not Sorry by Kathleen Marple Kolb. Chapter 1, Sorry I'm Late. Nothing ruins family game night faster than murder. But when your new man is a prosecutor, crime occasionally impinges on life. It wasn't a surprise to me. As a reporter's widow, I know work sometimes wins. Not that my own does. The whole reason I'm running the Unity Historical Society is to be close to my 8-year-old son's school. Well, that and the fact that I'm much happier with old stuff than with current trouble. This late June evening was the first time Joe Poley was coming over for dinner with the, quote, dads I should have had, my mentor Garrett and his husband Ed, a retired state trooper. Most of the time, they're an absolute blessing, especially in the 2 years since my husband died. Adding Joe to the mix was a little fraught, though. They'd been encouraging me to date. Christian Shaw, Garrett had said, you have to get out there unless you want to be an old lady who puts hats on her cats. They even liked Joe, but Ed knew too much about how cops and prosecutors can neglect their families, and he didn't think it was fair to Henry and me. Not his call. Not that I'd say so. Garrett started as my department chair in the Shoreline State University History Department and became a beloved mentor. When he married Ed, I just joined the brood, one 6-foot-tall redhead to go with 3 very cool adults from Ed's long-ago marriage to a woman. As far as Ed's concerned, no one is good enough for his kids. Joe knew and even agreed with Ed's concerns and promised to do his best to win him over. But Joe was off to a pretty bad start. Dinner, my summer standard zucchini lasagna, was set for 6:30, with a game of Sorry to follow. At 5:45, Joe called and told me he was going to have to work late because he had to cover an arraignment for another prosecutor. I know Henry needs to eat on time, he said, and I don't know how long this will take, but I'll be there for the game, and I picked up some dark chocolate squares earlier. Works for me, I said, and I'm sure Henry too. Ed's gonna hate it. Joe sounded like a misbehaving kid. Oh, probably, I assured him. Worry about it when you get here. Ed did indeed hate it. His spare face went from the big grin he gave Henry and his other grandbabies to a thundercloud scowl. Come on, I said. He didn't ask us to wait for him. He understood that Henry needs to stay on schedule. That, Ed pronounced with a scowl, is the minimum. Garrett, keeping his round, amiable face carefully neutral, cut his eyes to me. I think it's good that he gets it. Henry has type 1 diabetes. That's not the first or the most important thing to know about my son, but it does inform his life. Not nearly as much as his photographic memory, though, which affects the way he sees the world. But he does have to eat on time, and so we did. With Ed scowling and Garrett exclaiming over the lasagna in hopes of lightening the mood. But it didn't work. Joe arrived as I was loading the dishwasher and Henry was setting up the sorry board. "What color do you want?" Henry called out, sending Joe a bright, big grin. He had his dad's smile and dark hair and a sweetness that was all his own. "Is blue taken?" asked Joe. It was the same shade as his tie, which sets off his blonde hair and dark-eyed northern Italian coloring. "Yes, he's pretty hot, okay?" "Nope," Henry replied. "I'm red, Uncle Ed is green, Mom is yellow, and Uncle Garrett will take any excuse to sit out." Garrett greeted Joe with a friendly handshake. "Unlike Ed, I did not get the first round of sorry with my own ankle biters." Ed looked up from the board at his husband. "You're also terrible." Garrett shrugged, unfazed. "Well, there's that." As Joe sat, Ed shot him a little glare. "Arraignment, huh?" "Yeah, the Cool murder," Joe said. "They charged the sister." "Cool?" I asked. "As in Cool Ice Cream Parlor? Up near the green?" Joe nodded. As Henry parceled out pieces and set the cards in place on the board, Joe outlined the case. Sandra Cool, the oldest of the three Cool siblings, had been found by the dumpster at the family ice cream shop that morning with her throat cut, and the big knife her sister Barbara used to chop nuts for butter pecan and maple walnut on the ground beside her. Store employees arriving to make the day's supply of ice cream found the body. Then, as the officers closed off the scene, Barb wandered down from the upstairs apartment. She was disheveled and disoriented, and more than a little dizzy, none of which was incriminating, but she also had blood clearly visible on her blue tie-dye Crocs and her shirt. Now that was a problem. The only thing she said to the cops was, "I'm sorry." She didn't say what for, and no one could get any more out of her. They scooped her up and took her to the county lockup, where she spent the rest of the day curled in a ball in the corner of a holding cell. By afternoon, the crime lab was able to identify the blood as human and the same type as Sandra's. It was enough for Joe's boss. But, Joe admitted as Henry reached for the first card, it wasn't enough for him. "And why is that?" Ed asked, toying with one of the little green sorry men. "Because," Joe said, "there's a lot more to the Cools than good ice cream." Chapter 2. Sorry for your loss. "There is a lot going on there," Garrett agreed. "I know the family. So do you, Christian. Remember that little run-in you had with the brother?" "I did. About a year ago, when the Cool patriarch died, son Mikey had called the Historical Society and asked if we'd been interested in their collection of old dairy equipment and ice cream dishes. I might have been, except he was under the delusion that we had the budget to pay him thousands of dollars. I'll never forget that poisonous glare the guy gave me. Mikey, a balding, pudgy bro in a casino sweatshirt, started scowling as I explained that we'd write it up for the full retail value so he could get the maximum tax donation. "You're not going to pay me for it?" he asked, his eyes narrowing, his short fingers tightening. No," I said. Well, he stood and walked out, not even a goodbye. Struck me as weird at the time, but I know firsthand that everyone grieves differently. I vented to Garrett and forgot about it. Until now. As Garrett and I spun out the story for Joe, Ed's scowl deepened. And this time, he wasn't scowling at Joe. "Any insight, Ed?" Joe asked. He didn't actually call Ed sir, the way a Victorian swain would, but his tone implied it. "Actually, yeah," Ed said. "I think there's something up with the whole family." Just then, Henry gave Ed the puppy kid look. The grown-ups do not have the right to neglect the game. Ed took a card. 7! He moved his peg to a blue one and knocked Joe's man off the board with relish. "You're starting over, pal." "So are you." Joe parked his piece. "Give me the background on the Cool family." "Well," Ed began, "you know they've been selling ice cream in the old family homestead since sometime in the first half of the 20th century. We all nodded. A slow smirk spread across his face. "And they've been fighting over it almost as long. It started out with two Cool brothers, and one died in World War II. The widow sued over the buyout, even while she and her kids were living in the house with the other brother. You know how they handled the suit?" Everyone waited. "They got married!" Ed let out a rusty laugh. "And then they had another child together just to really mess up the family tree." By the 1980s, when I started stopping to get ice cream on the way home from the job, there were 3 generations working there, all with a claim to it and the land, and none of them getting along. "So there's a history," Joe said, taking a card. 4. "Oh, so much history." Ed watched as Joe took his turn, and then I mine, without much excitement. Henry picked up a card. 11! He beamed and turned his attention to the pieces. Henry could easily burn 5 minutes studying the board before deciding how to split up his moves. That's why he's the house sorry champ. In the meantime, Ed returned to the story of the Cools. "So a couple of daughters married and moved away. One of the sons got a medical degree and moved down to Westport. He's some sort of fancy plastic surgeon now. Other relatives moved on, and eventually they were down to Sandy, Barb, and Mikey, and a stray cousin or two, mainly because they weren't good enough for anything else." Henry started to move and thought the better of it, returning to his staring and strategizing. "Well, except for Sandy," Ed continued. "She absolutely loved the family business, enjoyed freezing the ice cream, meeting the customers, making people happy. She really threw herself into the whole thing. Barb's case is kind of sad. She got out of an abusive marriage, I think, and just liked to hide in the back and come up with new flavors. Probably felt safe that way, as if she'd been through some sort of trauma." As I said it, I realized Joe was watching me. "Not the time." I looked to Ed. "What about Mikey?" Ed shook his head. "He really wasn't good for much." Joe's focus turned sharply to him. "Got anything more specific?" Ed glanced nervously at Henry. "Nothing I can prove. He's always wearing a casino shirt, which suggests he might spend a lot of time gambling, but so do plenty of honest people. I know he's got a couple of minor drug pops, but so did half the population before we stopped enforcing small amounts of weed." 1, 2, 3, 4, Harry crowed. "You're going back to the start, Uncle Ed." Ed shook his head, and the rest of us chuckled. "And I know all about weed," Henry continued, his green eyes serious. "The technical term is cannabis. One of our teachers takes it because she has cancer. It's only for grown-ups unless your doctor says so." Garrett shot his husband a big smile. "I think the drug education is working." Joe flicked a brow to me, and Ed reached for a card. "Not so fast," Henry called. "I still have 7 more spaces. With this one." He moved his other piece and knocked mine off. "Back to the beginning, Ma." Henry beamed and nodded to Ed. "Now you go next." Ed drew a sorry and sent Joe back to the beginning again with a wry little grin. "You're not getting anywhere." "I'd rather get somewhere on this case," Joe replied, cutting his eyes to me and then back to Ed. "I really have a hard time imagining the worn-out woman I just arraigned as the killer." "Not that it can't happen," Ed reminded him. "Oh, I know." Joe thought for a moment and then cut his eyes to Henry. "Tell me more about Mikey, if Henry doesn't mind." Our game czar gave a gracious nod. Ed shrugged and continued, "I don't have much else, really. He hadn't made much of himself, and you'd think a 30-year-old guy wouldn't live with his 2 sisters unless he had to. Even a nice big house like that. And trying to sell off the equipment to Christian? That's weird." "It was definitely weird," I agreed. "Was the stuff valuable?" Ed asked. "Not as valuable as Mikey wanted it to be. I think he was hoping for tens of thousands, like the crazy finds on antique shows. This might have been worth a few thousand, probably more in the hundreds." I sighed. Some of the equipment was really old. They had some memorabilia, a Moxie clock and things like that, and the glassware too. Tell me about the glassware, Joe said. Those depression pieces can be very valuable, can't they? Oh, they can, I said. I thought about the photos Mikey had shown me on his phone. These were in good condition and old enough, but because so much of it was made and has survived, you have to take a close look at the maker and markings to know what you have, and I didn't get to that point. Maybe you should now, Joe said. The glassware is out on the shelves in the shop, like it's always been. I turned to Henry. Maybe you and I could go for ice cream after school, when they open again. Really? Henry beamed. The no-sugar chocolate sorbet is the best. Joe caught my gaze. You don't mind doing a little undercover work for me? Ed took a car. 4. He started moving. I turned to Joe and patted his arm. You'll owe me. He rested his hand on mine and gave me a smile worth more than a little spin. I'll find a way to pay you back. Back to the beginning, counselor. Ed knocked Joe's sorry man off the board. Again. It only felt that way. You getting hungry, Jack, with all this talk of ice cream?
That was gross.
Well,
She said gross stuff. I think it's my favorite part about these stories. Anytime there's a little romance, I'll just like act like a 5-year-old and be like, ew, who does that? Yeah, I'm getting married in 2 weeks. But still, I think it's funny.
I think it only feels that way for you because you have to hear your mom read it.
I know, it makes it worse.
I really like when the authors write it in just to creep you out.
It's
I think that's funny.
Gross. And Kira Jacobs does so good at making it so gross. I feel like she knows. Oh my gosh. I know she's not the one who wrote this, obviously, but
No,
still,
this is
some
Kathleen.
authors do a great job at grossing me out. But Kathleen,
Yes.
she's written some interesting stuff, man.
Yeah.
But
All
yeah,
right. You ready to dive into chapter 3?
of course.
Sorry, we were wrong. 2 days later, Henry set land speed records on the way out of Phyllis Wheatley Elementary. The first thing he did was tell me to set his insulin meter for the ice cream, just in case I hadn't had my eye on the ball. Then he returned to speed walking. Cool's Ice Cream is in a big Victorian house 1 block off of the town green, within a comfortable walking distance of both the school and our house. It's still in the town's historical district, which means the building must be maintained to strict and expensive standards. Very expensive, if the maintenance on the Historical Society's late 18th century building is any indication. I wondered what the upkeep and the historical status might mean for the Cool's house value. A house, and the money it's worth, are awfully good motivations for murder, after all. The shop was crowded, with the line spilling through the pocket doors of the former parlor, all the way into the old dining room across the hall. No surprise on their first day open since the murder. Some of it was likely the town showing support for the family. Some of it was looky-loos. Some people probably weren't sure which they were. No matter, it provided a perfect cover for me. I sent Henry over to get in line and contemplated the blackboard listing the daily offerings. Unlike a lot of places that grudgingly toss out a pasty vanilla and a scratchy ice that tastes like strawberry lip gloss, Cool's actually put some effort into its no sugar added flavors. I remembered Barb's smile as she dished up Henry's first cup of the deep dark cocoa sorbet that has become his favorite. The smile completely changed her sharp, sad face, giving her the eyes that somehow sparkled and softened the hollows. She told me her grandma loved ice cream, but never got to enjoy it after she developed diabetes. Hard to believe that such a sweet soul could carve up her sister. But not hard to believe that desperation can make people do horrible things. And now, 2 days out, the first DNA results showed that the killer was a relative. Joe's boss wouldn't go for a warrant to test the other relatives, preferring to believe it incriminated Barb, even if Joe still wasn't sold. Carefully low-key, I wandered through the old parlor, where the glassware occupied several built-in bookshelves. Shelves and walls were painted with a clean celadon green, the better to show off the clear glass and vintage posters. One of my favorite pieces at Cool's was the Moxie clock, merch for the New England soft drink, hanging between two built-in shelves. I always enjoyed looking at it and marveling at the generations of people who had done the same. Not at the generations of people who drank Moxie, that's for sure. The stuff is made with gentian root, and it's vile, at least to me. The Moxie clock, though, was gone. A slightly darker green patch marked where it had been. I noticed similar patches too. Someone was selling off things. Drug habit? Or in these brutal post-COVID times, just trying to keep the business going? I moved a little closer to the shelves. Everyone was busy gossiping about the murder and the Cools. One of the very rare times a giant redhead like me can go unnoticed. The glasses were in the same arrangement they always had been, with the same faint film of dust they always had. The high school kids who worked the counter dust them about once a week, so they're never perfectly clean, but never dirty either. A casual observer would have left it there. Since my livelihood revolves around old stuff, though, I'm not casual. The shape and thickness of the glass seemed different than I remembered. I took another carefully offhanded look around the room. Everyone still occupied. I picked up a glass and turned it over. The weight was wrong. It was too light. So was the construction of the piece, which had rough seams. Most wrong of all, the stamp on the bottom, made in China. Someone had replaced the Cool's elegant old pieces with cheap, modern knockoffs. Well, at least some of them. I put the fake back where I found it, mentally marking the spot in case fingerprints became important. As I slipped in line behind Henry, I glanced at an old whatnot in the corner. Even from a distance, I could tell. These ones were real. And really dusty. I reached for one. "Ma," Henry hissed, "don't touch that." I patted his arm and gave him the look of death. "Shh, this is important." He didn't look convinced, but he was quiet. Very carefully and quickly, I turned it over. Another surprise. "Ma, put it back," Henry nudged me. I did, just as the people in front of Henry started their order. "Whew. What are you thinking today, pal?" I asked, nodding to the board. He grinned. "Cocoa, of course." A tense, brittle voice made us turn. "Be with you in a second, okay?" None other than Mikey Cool was manning the counter, today in a t-shirt from a casino in New York. He looked tired and upset, which wasn't a surprise, and a little shaky as he handed a giant cone to a guy who looked like a high schooler. "Thanks," I said, trying for breezy. Mikey didn't respond. Henry was watching him and the counter kid intensely, deep in his treat zone, savoring every second of the process. I wasn't getting a treat, but I was observing pretty closely too, especially when I realized that the guy I'd taken for a counter kid was actually an adult. He had that scrawny look that teenage boys get during their growth spurts, but when he turned, I realized this was something much less healthy. The older couple in front of us ordered milkshakes, and Mikey moved over to do battle with a blender. That was new, too. They'd had a gorgeous 1950s shake machine, the kind of thing one of those vintage hipster cafes would kill for. Maybe somebody did. "What can I get you?" the guy behind the counter mumbled. He looked vaguely familiar. It wasn't until he turned to pick up the small cup that I realized why. He had the same gray-blue eyes and pointed chin as Mikey and Barb Cool. Mikey's features were obscured by pudge, and Barb's blurred a little by illness, but the overall face shape and eye color were the same. Another relative. Another possible contender for the blood. Henry nudged me. "Sprinkles." "Come on, pal, you know that they're loaded with sugar." "That's not it," Henry said. Just then, though, the guy started scooping and Henry was distracted by the timeless lure of watching his cup fill. But once the counter guy handed it over, Henry's brows knit. And as soon as I paid and dropped a $1 tip in the jar, he started mudging me again. "We need to talk to Mr. Poley," he said, actually pausing between bites. A sure sign of trouble. "What did you see, Henry?" He told me. It was different than what I'd seen, but confirmed my theory. Joe was in a New Haven court wrapping up another arraignment, and he promised to swing by the house as soon as possible. He suggested we invite Garrett and Ed over for a little impromptu sorry match. It wasn't really a suggestion. Considering what we just figured out, some extra caution was a very good idea. Chapter 5. Who's Sorry Now? By the time Joe got to Henry and me, Ed and Garrett were already ensconced in the living room, enjoying some good dark roast coffee and losing the latest sorry match. They, quote, happened to be at my door when Henry and I walked back from Cool's. Both are lousy liars, at least to me, so I knew Joe had sent them, but no one was going to admit it. Ed gave Joe a quick knowing smile when he walked in, and Garrett gave me an equally wise glance. Nothing brought two stand-up guys together like protecting the women and children. Yes, sexist as hell, but basically harmless and, well, even kind of cute. Coffee? I asked Joe. Not now, he replied. What did you two see? You first, Ma, Henry said, finishing a move that put him just one away from Garrett's pieces. Tell him about the glasses. As I explained the switch and the missing Moxie clock, Joe's expression changed and deepened into a scowl. So, he said, someone's been selling off valuables and replacing them with cheap stuff. Right, I said, but not all of them, and maybe not the best ones. Joe gave me a puzzled look. Now for my big reveal. The vintage pieces that were still there were made in occupied Japan. That makes them rarer and more valuable. Okay then, Garrett whistled. My mom's wedding china was made in occupied Japan. Overdone and ugly, but it fetched a nice penny on eBay. Only after I made you get rid of it, Ed said. So there still was at least one significant source of money. Joe was clearly thinking out loud. And it could have been important. You checked the financials? I asked. Business is hanging on by a thread, Joe said. No obvious reason. They own the place, no big renovation or equipment loans. What about the personals? Ed asked as he drew a card. Nobody was in good shape except Sandra. Looks like Barb's divorce and some kind of health issue, maybe mental health treatment. It wrecked hers. Joe shook his head. The brother and cousin have almost nothing, just a bank account with enough in it to pay for basics. 2! Back to the beginning, Henry, Ed crowed. Henry scowled. Garrett shot them both a glare. Ed glared back and he asked, What about Sandra? She was doing okay until COVID, Joe sighed. Looks like she spent down everything she had to keep the place going. She might have been the one who sold off the glass, I said. It would be a quiet desperation move. It would, Joe agreed. But one of the others could have done it for their own needs. Mikey, Ed said. Those casino shirts didn't just fall on him. Could have been Barb, too, Garrett reminded us as he took a card. She was in trouble, too. Not her fault, but trouble. No faster way to go bankrupt than serious illness and inadequate insurance. Joe sighed. The cousin, Floyd Lawrence, he's no winner either. Bunch of minor drug offenses and never seemed to be earning much. So Sandra was keeping them all afloat, I asked. Hey, Henry piped up. Can I talk now? Everyone turned to him. Sorry, buddy. Joe started it, but we all echoed him. Back to the game in a few, I said, motioning Henry to come out from the board. Start with the special sprinkles. The cousin guy, he said. A lady asked him for special sprinkles, and he took some from a drawer underneath instead of the topping place. What did they look like? Asked Joe, as Ed's gaze sharpened, cop radar on. Well, same as the other sprinkles. Henry shrugged. They're in the top drawer under the hot fudge pot. I'll go back and get a search warrant. Thanks, pal. Joe gave him a light man-to-man punch on the arm. Is that it? No, I saw Miss Sandra yell at him once, and he looked back at her like he wanted to hurt her. You know, made a fist and his neck got weird. I do know. Joe's eyes were wide and he shot me a glance. He best get used to Henry. Anything else? Henry thought for a moment. Yeah, Mr. Cool is wearing gloves today. Some of the other kind of people wear gloves, but he doesn't. Okay. Joe's brows arched in confusion. Henry gave the stupid grown-up an exasperated glare. He had a big Band-Aid on the palm of his hand. All right, Jack, we're at the deliberation.
We are?
We are.
Dude, I'm not going to win this one.
Before we go in, I want to remind people that Mysteries to Die For remains ad-free in exchange for not making you hit the fast-forward button, so don't do it. Support our authors by checking out their backlist and picking up a title. This week is Kathleen Marple-Kalb. As you heard, the newest title in her Christian Shaw series, and this is a Christian Shaw short story that we're listening to, The Stuff of Murder, is out. You can check out her complete backlist from her website and your favorite bookseller. All I know is I really want ice cream now.
Well, we have some.
Oh, yeah, we do. You bought some yesterday.
Yep.
I know what I'm getting after this podcast.
All right, so help me deliberate.
All right.
Give me the facts.
All right, so instead of being out for the win, prosecutor Joe Poley wants to get the right bad guy. He's got Christian and Henry helping him, and he's got us. So let's help figure out who killed Sandra Cool before we're the ones who are sorry. Our suspects are, there's only 3 of them. Barb Cool, the quiet sister who escaped a bad marriage with debt and health issues. Mikey Cool, the younger brother who has a gambling problem, maybe or maybe not drug issues, and no funds. And Floyd Lawrence, a cousin working in the shop who has arrest for drugs and who isn't exactly looking healthy these days.
Interesting.
So here's what we know. Sandy Cool was found behind the family house/business. Her throat was cut with the knife found next to her, the one Barb used in the creamery's kitchen. Preliminary DNA tests indicated her killer was related to Sandy.
All right.
Cool Ice Cream was on hard times. The business wasn't the ice cream float it once was. I really like some of these puns, by the way.
That's a good one.
Sandy was known to love the family business, including the customers. She was keeping everyone from tripping on the rocky road.
Really?
Mikey tried selling antique glasses and other collectibles to Christian for the museum. Many of those items are not missing from the parlor, but some have been replaced with cheap knockoffs.
Were they in mint chocolate chip condition?
I didn't think of that one. That is awesome. The most valuable pieces are still in the shop. Barb was arrested by the sheriff after she came down to meet them with blood on her Crocs and shirt and said, "I'm sorry." The blood was confirmed to be the same type as Sandy's.
Okay.
Henry noticed Floyd gave some customers sprinkles from a drawer instead of the normal cup, and Sandra yelled at him, drawing his anger. Henry also noticed that Mikey was wearing gloves, which he didn't usually do, and had a bandage under it. So, time to place your order. Which flavor is your pick for murder of the day?
So there's a Sandy and a Sandra.
No, they're the same person.
Oh.
So the dead woman is Sandra.
Okay.
Then there's the sister Barb.
Okay.
That's the one that's been arrested.
Uh-huh.
There's Mikey, which is he's kind of the casino boy who's gambler, and then there was Lloyd, who's I guess the drug guy. That's the implication of him not looking quite healthy.
Interesting. Now Barbara was the one found with blood all over her, right?
Yep.
So it's not her. Too obvious.
Okay.
You gotta game these guys. If you look at it too easily, then it won't work. Then there's the drug addict or the gambler.
Yeah. Yep. Mikey's the gambler. Lloyd is the drug addict.
Was Mikey the one who had the bandage on his hand?
Yes, Mikey has the bandage on his hand.
Okay, interesting. I think the druggie is just doing his own side gig. I'm sure he's mad at Sandra, but he just seems like an angry guy all around. Mikey needs the money, clearly. Well, they all need the money, but Mikey doesn't quite have a side gig, unlike Floyd, who already does. So maybe, I don't know. I could see it being more like Floyd's character if he is a drug addict and he is a dealer to be doing those little thefts and to maybe, get mad at Sandra. Obviously, I mean, not obviously. in my opinion, the way Sandra probably died was she caught one of the two of them doing the illegal thing, whether it be caught Floyd dealing the drugs or caught Mickey stealing. That led to the murder, probably. So like that could have played out with either character. I think it's more likely to be Mickey, just because Floyd to me is a little too obvious with the whole drug thing. He's clearly dealing something with the special sprinkles or whatever. Barbara, I'm really just not picking her because she seems too obvious. But nothing about her says she should be murderous, right?
Right, except that she has the blood on her clothes.
Right. She has
and
no
it was,
motive.
I guess it was her knife. Well, it wasn't her knife so much. It was the knife that she used in the kitchen.
Well, nonetheless, everyone had access to it.
Yes. Yep, totally.
So
Everyone had access to it.
I'm leaning towards Mikey.
Okay.
He had the strongest kind of start as the bad guy, and then they flowed away from him over to Mickey or to Floyd. So I'm gonna go with good old Mickey Mouse here.
All right.
Say the mouse.
All right. So time for all of you listeners to lodge in your favorite flavor there. Another quick reminder to check out our print and ebooks for you mystery readers. The companion book for this season, Part 1, was released in March, and Part 2, which this story is a part of, called Games People Play Final Move. I remember the name of our own books. It will be out in September. So buy one for you and the mystery lover you love. The dimes and quarters from the sales do support the podcast and keep Jack and now me in ice cream and snow cones. So now, Chapter 6, Nothing to be Sorry For. The adults exchanged glances. Stabbings tend to leave the assailant with cuts on the hands, Joe said. Actually, stabbing a human to death is a much harder thing than it seems on TV, in every way. Until that moment, all Henry knew was that he'd seen something that stood out. When he spoke, though, he suddenly sounded like a little kid for the first time in all ages. It was Mikey, wasn't it? Sure looks like it, buddy, Joe said, putting a hand on his arm. I'll have the cops pick him up for a second interview. He has some hard questions to answer. The only question left is, why? Garrett picked up his coffee cup. Joe and Ed both shrugged and shared a guilty glance and then a hard little chuckle. Garrett, Henry, and I waited. Well, Christian, Ed began, motive is nice on TV cop shows. But in the real world, Joe continued, I'm not required to prove motive. And in this case, I've got at least two viable ones. Money, drugs, or a combination of the two. Any or all will do. And Mikey's not organized enough to cover his tracks, Ed said. When Joe gets the warrant for the DNA, it'll be on the knife. I plan to throw the report down in front of him and get a confession. Joe allowed himself a scary little smile. What about Cousin Floyd's special sprinklers in the drawer, I remind him. He's going to get something for this, isn't he? He should. Joe's scary smile faded to a rueful expression. No promises. Drug cases are weird. That they are, Ed agreed. But we can at least clear Barb. Joe shrugged. Put the right guy away is sometimes all you get. A few evenings later, Henry was setting up the sorry board again when Joe called and suggested Garrett and Ed join us to pick up a pint or two from Cool's first. There had to be a lot more than ice cream going on, and there sure was. Inside, Barb Cool was behind the counter, greeting a couple of patrons with a faint but noticeable smile. Joe met us at the door, and when Barb saw us, she handed off the scoop to the high schooler working the other side of the case. Hi, Mr. Poley, she said with a shy smile. It's Joe, he said, smiling back. Just wanted my friends to see you're okay. Garrett shot me a meaningful glance at the pause before friends. Ed guided Henry over to the go-to freezer without even glaring at Joe. Barb looked at me. That's right, you're Dr. Shaw from the Historical Society. You figured out what was going on with the glass. I did, I said. I wasn't sure what to say, so I offered the obvious, I'm sorry. Don't be, she said. If you hadn't, everyone would have thought I did it. She sighed. Sandra was selling off everything we had to save the business, and Mikey wanted to get out while we still had some money left. I never thought he'd turn on her like that. We waited. I had one of my bad nights. Long haul Lyme, a ragged breath. Sometimes I can't get out of bed. I heard something late that night, and I crawled down and found her. Oh no, I said. I patted her arm. I'd learned, in my years as an unusually young widow, that it's better to make small supportive gestures than to say something stupid. Yeah, she breathed again, steadying herself. I should have called the cops, but I saw her lying in that pool of blood and I fell apart. I didn't even try to get help. I went back upstairs and I hid. When I woke up, I kind of hope I imagined it all. The blood on my shoes and my shirt made it all too real. Garrett nodded, offering a kind lie. Understandable, he said. But I hadn't, she turned to Joe. And if you hadn't thought something was wrong. I did, though, Joe said, and we figured it out. All's well that ends well, I offered. It was lame, but it was the best I had. Barb stood a little straighter and managed a small, brave smile. I'm still here, and still scooping. And, Ed said, picking up a couple to-go pints from the case, we're going to have to do our best to keep you in business. You got no sugar added, Uncle Ed? Henry asked. You bet I did, champ. Get another one, Joe said. This one's on me. Sorry, Ed said, giving Joe a warm smile. You're going to let me treat this time. Been a little rough on you. Joe shrugged. Only fair. Gotta watch out for these two. At the sight of my big men settling things, Henry laughed, that wonderful happy little boy sound that comes from somewhere near his toes. Of course, he had the last word. Sorry, not sorry. The end.
Yay. I was
You
right.
got it right.
Nailed it.
Yeah. So I do think, with Floyd being the drug guy, like, the selling off the antiques was too sophisticated. I think he just would have pawned it all.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. If you're just trying to get money quick, you're not gonna go to a museum.
Mm-hmm.
That seems odd.
Yeah.
But also my main thing was that, he had a gig lined up for him to be making money.
Yeah, he was selling through the ice cream shop.
So it didn't
store.
make sense that he'd need to do another thing. I mean, obviously, in reality, people would, but for the sake of the story.
Well, I guess,
One's
like
enough.
you said, that if Sandra had walked in on him or could have cornered him, he could have, quasi-defensively attacked her.
Yeah, it really could have been either of those two. But in the end, there really were only two suspects. You could have said Barbara, but none of the story explained. Nothing said it could be Barbara. They
Right.
never even interrogated her.
Oh, they
Did they
did.
interrogate her? Well, they never really investigated her. They immediately just went, all right, what else is happening?
I guess we fell into Joe's belief that it wasn't her.
Yeah.
I guess it could have been a twist that, no, Joe was wrong. It really was her. But I think from the beginning, you're kind of buying into Joe's thinking that something in this isn't right, that she's too frail to have frail mentally and physically to have done it.
The other thing, I think both Floyd and Mickey had a problem, but only Floyd was doing something to supplement it. We didn't see what Mickey was doing to, fix his financial problems. We saw what he was attempting to do. We saw it didn't work. And then we saw maybe he was finding other ways to do it because now stuff is missing. But because they didn't go into it a lot, it kind of makes you go, something more is there. It's going to get explained at the deliberation because he did it.
Yeah, I think you're on a roll. You got a couple right in a row here.
Oh, yeah. That's like 2.
I think.
I know I got this one and the last one. I don't remember if I got the last one of the part 1 of this season.
Yeah, I don't remember either.
No idea.
Okay, want to learn a little bit about the game Sorry?
I would love to.
So the game Sorry was created in England in the late 1920s by William Henry Story, who registered it as a trademark in the UK in 1920 and received a US patent in August of 1930. The patent link is in the show notes. It's kind of a really cool. I'm really getting into these patent links lately. The patent describes in detail the parts of the board, the men, the cards, and how to play. Mr. Story went on to say that, quote, the above apparatus Okay, so this is like strictly right out of the original writing, so just you have to stick with me here because this is one of the longest sentences ever written. The above apparatus used as above described is calculated and has been proved by experience to be a prolific source of amusement and provides a game which calls for the exercise of a great deal of judgment while being dependent in a measure on an uncertain factor, such as is calculated to add to the excitement of the game, though due to the choice of the moves allowed when certain cards are turned up, the influence of the element of chance as a determining factor is much reduced in comparison with the skill exercised by a player in choosing his moves. Yes, that was one sentence and not even the whole sentence. I'm not sure what it said either. Several sources cite the Indian game, I'm going to butcher this, Pachisi, as inspiration or the basis for Sorry. The link to the Wikipedia page is in the show notes. Rather than a square board, Pachisi uses a cross-shaped board. The goal is to move all of your pieces onto and around the board before the other players. The number of spaces moved is determined by throwing shells and counting how many land upright. There are several variations of the game, some dating, yes, back to 1100 to 800 BC. So yeah, check out the show notes. There's a couple really interesting ones. I was not expecting Sorry to have such a deep history. And now, about our author, Kathleen Marple-Kalb. Kathleen Marple-Kalb describes herself as an anchor, author, mom, not in that order, an award-winning weekend anchor at New York's 101 Wins Radio. She writes short stories and novels, including the Ella Shane and Old Stuff mysteries, both from Level Best Books. As Nikki Knight, she writes the Grace the Hit Mom and Vermont Radio mysteries. Her stories have appeared in Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine. My tongue just decided to stop working. Her stories have appeared in Alfred Hitchcock's mystery magazine, Black Cat Weekly, online and in anthologies, and been shortlisted for Derringer and Black Orchid Novella Awards. She's also written several times for Mysteries to Die For. We really enjoy her stories. She and her husband and her son live in Connecticut house that is owned by their cat. That wraps up this episode of Mysteries to Die For. Support our show by subscribing, telling a mystery lover about us, and giving us a 5-star review. Check out our website, tgwolff.com/podcast, for links to the authors for this season. Mysteries to Die For is hosted by TG and Jack Wolff. Sorry Not Sorry was written by Kathleen Marple-Kalb. Music and production are by Jack Wolff. Episode art is by TG Wolff. Join us next week for a toe tag, which is the first chapter from a fresh release in the mystery, crime, or thriller genre, and then come back in 2 weeks for our next original story, Dare or Truth by Frank Zafiro, where Truth or Dare is the featured game. All right, Jack, take us out.